soon as the projector comes online.
Okay.
I watched the show about that inmate leasing.
What?
Inmate leasing in Alabama. And
Oh,
that was
great.
very, very interesting.
Wait, Churchill had a shooting?
Inmate leasing, huh?
Yeah, it was very
Oh, you're on.
Lockdown.
Yeah, I'm on,
Took the
right.
school?
Oh, shut up.
You have a good
So
crew.
we got,
Is it on the news?
yeah, that's what it was.
You know you're being recorded live now, because you're talking at a level where the mic can pick you up.
Churchill had a shooting today?
That's what it says, yeah. In Swan's name, so.
Okay.
Kids are posting on Facebook, but they're supposed to be at school. They got sent home. That's
Oh.
great. My coach at Churchill.
Well, interesting doings in our community as always.
Always.
All right, so I knew there was something.
Your files.
Right. Do you want them?
I think some people want their midterm.
Some people want their midterm, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. So, pardon me while I call the office.
Have it delivered.
Right. In my haste to make sure that I had the finals,
Is it cumulative? Is the final cumulative or just from week 7?
it's yeah, it's cumulative. Too late. All right. We'll just rush through, leave early, I'll come back. Take notes, like you're supposed to anyway. All right, so you understand that material that we're covering in class is not just to pass tests. This is weapons. This is war without being too dramatic about it. Sometimes you have to actually not necessarily battle people, but what you're battling is their ignorance. And yeah, so because this is the African American experience, and what Robin Kelly, as much as I like Robin Kelly, you know, he does tell a good story. It's not totally the story that I would tell, but you know, it's useful. And so what I noticed, and this isn't going to be on the final, but it's time period, and we're going to actually be covering it for next term if you decide to stay to next term. So we haven't really covered a whole lot of Africa other than to talk about the Berlin Conference, right? So Berlin Conference, if you remember that, basically the European colonial powers and America dividing up the dark continent in the late 19th century. So when you have things, just like you mentioned about convict leasing, basically that's just, okay, convicts are property. Once they're in the criminal justice system, they're considered property. Much like one of you wrote in your reaction papers, athletes are considered property of the university, and as long as they perform athletically, we don't really care what they do academically, because we're not expecting them to, right? Because if college is really farm team for the NFL, why? Why do we have an NCAA? That's like slavery. Why not just actually pay them cash money? Because you're making millions off of them.
Yes, you are.
Okay? Millions. And what are they getting paid? Oh, they're getting paid in education if they're getting it. So the experience, for example, of a Robeson, and that's why I'm using him as a standard of reference for what a black athlete should be, you should not trust the system to educate you. You should be grabbing your education outside of the classroom. Because once you get hurt, they will kick you to the curb. Count on it. And then, if they don't kick you to the curb and you actually are successful, and you're a football player, I mean, now there's lawsuits with, the professional football players about, oh, you knew this was brain injuring and you didn't do anything about it? So, right, will you live as long as, a regular non-athlete or an athlete that didn't have brain injuries? They know about that stuff. It's kind of like you're a gladiator, just like in the movie Gladiator. You're expendable for our entertainment. But there can be some good things that come out of that. I'm not downing it entirely, and so we'll look to John Carlos when we talk about John in the 60s and 70s and all that. So, European colonial powers dividing up the dark continent. So, it's not like Africans are just sitting on their drums while all this is going on. They're actually organizing, and that was kind of the part of the story that Robin Kelly didn't talk about. You may have noticed, but if you didn't notice it, I'm calling your attention to it. Not putting him down. Americans tend to have an American-centered focus. But those of us who come from cultures that are older than America have a global focus. And so understand, I got an email from somebody talking about, oh, look at the palace that Mugabe's living in and look at how his people is living in. Well, right. Mugabe's living in the palace because he is supplying the West with strategic minerals so you can have your iPads and computers. And so he's living richly while his people are living poorly. Right? He's not a dictator that we're trying to depose. Neither was Gaddafi. Neither was Chavez, neither whatever. I'm not putting them in the same vein as dictators, but look at our point of view and why their people may or may not have had that same point of view about them. Right? So, Africans were organizing. So the PanAfrican Movement. So anytime you see the word pan, it comes from, I think it's the Greek, it means across, all. Right? So Pan-African. So there are some folks that will resist that because Africa is a continent, not a country. Right? So it's easy to try and stereotype folks, but there are differences that need to be observed. So like within Indian country, for example, there is a resistance to having a pan-Native American idea or movement because they're different, right? But we need to understand that you need to have some common ground to reorganize with, right? So Pan-African Movement at least means the unity of Africans and the elimination of white racial domination from the continent. So this starts really in the diaspora. And however you want to define diaspora, if you want to start with, the transatlantic slave trade, fine, that's okay. People were resisting from the beginning, okay? Just like the Jews were resisting Hitler, right? We don't necessarily get that point of view, but that was happening as well. There was armed resistance to a lot of this stuff that wasn't necessarily talked about in the dominant histories, all right? So beginning the diaspora, continuing into the 20th century, and then forming the discourse where Africans in the Caribbean, the Americas, call for solidarity of all African people. You see this with Garvey, you see this with Du Bois, you see this with lots of folks. And so not just the guys, the women are talking like this as well. So from Du Bois's point of view, and I'm basically using the text that we used last term and the text we'll return to again next term, Molefe Asante's The History of Africa book. So if you talk to Du Bois in recounting this history, he doesn't count this particular conference even though he was there, and he was at all of them. For the following reason. So it was called the Pan-African Conference in 1900, so this is like pretty close on the heels of the Berlin Conference, and it's in London. Now, if you look at the politics of how you do this, okay, groups, this goes back into England where when the target was the Irish and Scots, you can't gather in more than 3 groups of 3, or else they call it the Riot Act, right? 3 or more of you talking, and even talking loud or talking against the government, is a riot. So this is why, half jokingly, we talked about in the 60s, you know, or you might have seen me in the corridor when there's like 3 black people, oh, 2/3 of a riot, or a riot in progress, right? Only half joking, basically referring to that time. So notice these conferences are not happening in Africa, because Africa is under the influence of the colonialists and might be somewhat dangerous. But a Trinidadian lawyer, Henry Sylvester Williams, calls this Pan-African Conference. So Du Bois because the keynote speaker was a white British bishop in the church, who he at least wanted Africans educated to the level of self-governance. So I mean, that is going along with the conference, but do you really need a white guy to give you blessing to get the freedom that was traditionally yours, any more than, you know, for example, like Sojourner Truth really needs white women to say, look, I'm a woman, a black woman speaking out, and, you know, that ain't I a woman speech is the speech that she made after she had to take off her shirt and show her tits and say, look, I'm a woman, I'm speaking out. Ain't I a woman? I've done all this stuff. I should be at this women's right to vote conference. It's not just about the white girls, it's about women, right? That we have a common experience. Yeah, Tim.
That's even more ironic considering what the British had done in the previous century to that in Africa.
Oh, yeah. And we're going to continue to do it. But sometimes we, so there was an African American delegation, including Du Bois, Anna Jones, and Anna Julia Cooper, who was an African American woman with a degree from the Sorbonne. So giving you an idea that, okay, black people, this is out of slavery. Okay, we are acting on the world stage, whether it makes the New York Times or not. Acting on our own. Right? Ms. Cooper drafted a petition to Queen Victoria outlining a number of injustices, which I'm not going to go into here, but we'll go into further depth when we start off with this time period, because basically there'll be a little bit of overlap to give you context. Now, there were 5 Pan-African Congresses. So when Du Bois talks about the history of this, even though he was at the conference, he doesn't even count it, doesn't even mention it in the same breath. So there were 5 of these going, and the last one ending in 1945. One of the reasons, and they're getting bigger and bigger in scope and influence. And the reason I mentioned, basically, because we're ending in 1945, is the 5th one basically ends in a UN resolution because they're forming the UN. And part of the platform gets adopted as part of the UN human rights resolution in the original charter. So the first one was in Paris, directed by Du Bois, 57 delegates from 15 countries, 12 of them from Africa, the rest being from here and the Caribbean. Second was in London, Brussels, and Paris. 113 delegates, 42 from Africa, 35 from the US, 24 from Americans living in Europe, and 7 from the West Indies. All right? Now, notice one of the things that's happening that continues somewhat to the present day, that there are some educated black folk that are American that cannot stand living here. So they go to Europe, where, you know, quite frankly, there are some Europeans that are more tolerant of the idea of educated black people because they have a long history of educated black people doing stuff. If you have iTunes, I just picked up on this, I've been reading this biography of Dumas' father. So Dumas' father was homies with the Chevalier de Saint George, who was the best swordsman in Europe at the time, black man, who also composed music. In fact, they call him the Black Mozart. So his stuff is in iTunes, and you listen to that, and so I'm gonna actually start kicking it. And so just to trip up somebody that says, "Why are you listening to that white music?" Shut up. You ignorant. Really. Like Duke Ellington's white music too? I mean, Quincy Jones? Shut up. Beethoven? Shut up. You're colonized. Decolonize your mind. So third, London and Lisbon. So another way you can look at this is they're having these conferences, Pan-African Movement, basically in the heart of the beast, as it were. New York City, 1927. And then the fifth in Manchester, England. So Du Bois was there, Padmore was there, Kwame Nkrumah was there, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Marcus's first wife or second wife? First wife, I think. So the resolutions that were drafted there became part of the UN Charter on Human Rights. So more about that later. Also, we should give honorable mention to the African National Congress in South Africa, which is also part of the Pan-African Movement. And in 1944, the people that you now think of as associated as being the ANC, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Tambo, basically who are now leaders of South Africa, who are basically part of a youth movement in the ANC that now are running the country, or now are the elder leaders of the country. So from my pushing 60 perspective, anybody that's less than 30 without kids is a kid. Sorry to be ageist, but right? The youth are the future. So it ain't just youth being teenagers.
Ageist? Is that what you said?
Ageist, yes.
It's like sexist,
Yeah,
but ageist.
yeah.
I've never heard that
Yeah.
before.
Oh yeah, well, you know, we used to
Always
think,
means something.
yeah, before I was 30, we thought, don't trust anybody over 30. And then I reached 30, and well, part of it is, you know, when you're 19, you think you know everything, and when you're 21, you realize you don't know shit. Really, but you can't tell a 19-year-old that they don't know shit, because they think they know it all, right? Until, you know, you add a couple of years and you realize, wow, my parents were really kind of smart after all. You know, respect your elders, you know, because they do know something, you know. A young broom, there's an old African proverb that says, a young broom has more spring, but the old broom knows the corners. All right, so ANC was also allied with the Natal Indian Congress, the Transvaal Indian Congress in 1947. So separate groups of color within South Africa are organizing themselves, because the fact that they're doing that, and this is part of the analysis I want you to look at, is what's being said below the surface in the words. If they're having to organize separately, there's a barrier keeping them from organizing together. So if you caught Arun Gandhi's thing where he's basically talking about being beaten up by black people and white people together, and so yeah, if you're getting beat up by black people and white people in the same racist environment, who do you trust? Who do you make alliances with? You can make alliances with both, but it might be based on conditional. You cannot expect an ally to act in your interest against their own. That's not reasonable. Okay, so more detail next term. So culture is a form of wealth. So natives, basically, when they had their gift economy, Africans pre-contact, that is colonial contact, had a concept that history and culture were wealth and could be traded without, basically, if I have knowledge that I share with you, you lose the knowledge, but you are enriched by it if you appreciate it and understand that that's what it is. So culture is everything that is necessary to ensure survival. and particularly what gives life meaning in order to survive hard times. The tricks of the trade or the things that make you feel better. So culture is not just art and music and things that make you feel good. It's also maybe a framework for understanding what's happening to you in oppression, so you can deal with it. Right? So the reason that we remember painful stuff is not to cause pain, but to build strength. And that's part of our cultural heritage. Definitely the stereotype of black people is we will talk about racism and other systems of discrimination, and we will develop sciences for understanding that and overcoming it. So, to build strength. So, lynching photography wasn't to abuse you, but just to say, okay, this is a common reality that we know. If I talk about people being whipped in whips and chains in Hawaii in 1930, you need to understand that that's corporate, that's slavery, and it was sanctioned and known. That wouldn't have been basically put up with in any state in the United States. Yes, we had chain gangs in the South. Yes, we had contract convict labor. But whipping was for transgressions, not necessarily like what was happening in Hawaii. And the fact that we didn't here in the States, on the continent, we didn't know about that until Hawaiians started talking about, yeah, this is what my grandfather experienced, and started writing down that history and being included within the canon of ethnic studies. Right? So secret information becoming more visible. That's a form of wealth. Right? So you build strength not by focusing on the weakness, but by paying attention to what needs strengthening. So don't think of it as weakness. Think of it as you need strengthening. Your algebra problems are not problems. They are skill-building exercises that you have to repeat until the skill becomes reflexive. I know you don't want to think of it like that. Yeah, try that with my Math 10 teacher, my Math 60 teacher. I'm just giving you the idea that it will work. All right? So, hence, within this time period, the explosion of arts, literacy clubs, black philanthropy, black political and social movement, the ability to move towards opportunity and persist towards that opportunity when blocked. In fact, we train for the blocks, predict them. Right? And then once you have the opportunity, to protect that opportunity when it is threatened. Because it's always going to be threatened. Really? Supreme Court reconsidering the Voting Rights Act? Because there's no discrimination? Really? Where are they getting that? So, keep your game tight and keep laced and ready. Sorry, that's a basketball metaphor, but hey.
That's a good one.
Keep your game tight and keep laced and ready. Read your Machiavelli, not Tupac's Machiavelli, the prince. Okay? How do those in power keep their power? How do those without some forms of power stay strong? Study that too. So, know your science. Could be a matter of life and death. More about that in a few slides. It's very important to be scientifically literate. I do mean it as a criticism about hip-hop having an anti-intellectual, anti-literacy streak, an anti-scientific streak. You're using highly technical gear, but you don't know how to build it from the ground up yourself. That's dangerous. So if the net crashes, then where are you? As an exercise within my addiction class, I have people give up some form of media. You know, people trip out when they can't text. They do.
No, that's right.
That's true. They leave their phone or something, they go crazy.
Right. Okay, so think about when you receive a text,
Yeah, look at
like,
that.
Wouldn't it be better to just dispose of whatever the business is by phone, by voice? Because you got a real-time connection, and are you finding that when you're texting with somebody that this is a conversation worth having?
Yeah, but you can be smoother in the conversation through text.
Notice, okay, so argue for your limitations and they will be yours. I'm just saying, all right? Any technology that you become dependent on that you can't make yourself can be taken away. I'm just saying. You know, I've lived through, you know, we were going to go through the end of the world in December, you know, solstice in 2012, right? So that was like the 5th time in my lifetime the world was coming to an end. You know, there's lots of, you know, science fiction shows that I watch that talk about the end of the world, right? And it's like, okay, what happens when there's no electricity? Would people know how to live? Could you do that? Right? Because part of our cultural wealth, you know, I used to think of my grandma as kind of backwards, but I understood that, wait, they knew how to grow a garden. They knew about herbs for medicine because they couldn't go to doctors. So that's why Pops became a doctor. That's why our family became health and scientifically literate. Sure, I can survive anywhere between the Mexican border and Canada on the weeds. I wouldn't like to. I like my comforts. But I can do it. But the point is, how many of you can do that? How many of you could live without your tech? Right? How many of you could rebuild civilization from scratch if you needed to? Which is why I appreciated going to Africa, because at the level that we live and the level that they live, they're prepared to do it, because they've been only doing it for like close to 200,000 years. So, look at that. Know your science. Could be a matter of life or death.
It might just take a little longer to adapt.
Might. It might. Hopefully we'd have the time. So definitely know your hidden history and the riddle of the hero is the teller of the tale. So, the other Tuskegee. This is where your scientific literacy will come into play. So, the other day we learned about the Tuskegee Airmen. So Tuskegee is one of those historically black colleges and universities in Alabama. The reason the Tuskegee Airmen are sent there is because we're still having a segregated army, et cetera, et cetera. The other Tuskegee, which is the one that you people usually know about if they know about anything. Okay? So within black history. This is the one that was usually not talked about, that we knew as what we call a cautionary tale. So like Brer Rabbit is a cautionary tale. Basically, Brer Rabbit is based on that whole story about the tar baby. Brer Rabbit lives in the briar patch. Briar patch is any hostile environment. And the rabbit is the African equivalent of coyote here in Turtle Island. He's the trickster. Coyote does the most stupid thing, because Coyote is the creator of the universe. So he does the most stupid thing to teach you by example what not to do. Because he can come back. You can't. All right? So part of the African axiology, the highest value is the relationship. You know, you give the nod. You say what's up. And if you don't, who do you think you are? Right? So Brer Rabbit shows you, gets mad at the tar baby for not saying anything and then gets caught by his enemies. So that's teaching you, yes, you can acknowledge people, but if they don't lose your cool. Cautionary tale. All right? So Emmett Till was a cautionary tale that I learned before, actually my first racial attack at 7 in Disneyland. Oh, some white people don't like you. Not all white people, some. Just need to know the difference, who they are, what they say, and speak up if it's safe to do so. Emmett Till was a cautionary tale. Mainstream didn't know about that because mainstream didn't know about lynching unless you were in the South. Emmett Till wasn't from the South. I'm not going to go into him. We're going to go into the civil rights movement when we go into next term. Emmett Till is one cautionary tale. Tuskegee is another. Now this is what, when you have patterned neglect based on science or medicine, it's predictable. So if you were to read, for example, and I strongly suggest you acquire these books. So, Medical Apartheid. And let's see, Henrietta Lacks, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which is an entire book. So Medical Apartheid by Washington, and Henrietta Lacks is by Rebecca Skloot. Very cool white woman and an ally. So the story of Henrietta Lacks is part of Medical Apartheid, but basically Rebecca was able to write a whole book about this particular woman's story, which is an example of medical apartheid. All right? And of course, there's actually whole books, written about Tuskegee, Bad Blood. All right, so the other Tuskegee. All right, for 40 years, between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted an experiment on nearly 400 black men in the late stages of syphilis. These men, for the most part, were illiterate sharecroppers from one of the poorest counties in Alabama, were never told what disease they were suffering from or of its seriousness. Informed that they were being treated for bad blood, their doctors had no intention of curing them of syphilis at all. Okay? This was not illegal at the time. This was not unethical at the time. Okay? So if we were going to categorize it, you could call it sociostructural violence. Now, what Washington talks about is, okay, like the speculum was invented by using pewter spoons put together. They're made of plastic today, and they're smooth, et cetera, basically used in gynecology, women's health, but before they were basically made with sharpened metal spoons on anesthetized slave women that had to be held down while this doctor operated without anesthesia. That was normal because they weren't human, because they're slaves, right? But Washington's basic point was, okay, health experimentation is done on us, but it doesn't benefit us. I mean, if you were going to be a volunteer to be mistreated to advance the cause of science, well, that's one thing. But that wasn't happening then, right? Now, part of, well, I'll just say it, why not? I believe in science. I believe in doing research. Unfortunately, I don't believe in this kind of science. Okay? Which is basically double-blind control groups. Not because you don't get factual information, but because it allows you to deny people treatment when you know it works. And I'm not down with denying people access to treatment that works for any reason, which caused a little problem with the department that I was in, that I got kicked out doing my doctoral work. Okay, if I'm going to deliver health care to a population that isn't getting health care, and I know stuff that works, I want to give everybody everything. It's like, which slave do you decide not to free? It's the slave themselves that decides they want to still be in chains or freeze themselves. You don't make that determination, right? So, this cohort of 399 black men was going to be in the untreated condition. There are others, okay, as a control group. They're going to be in the untreated condition. Okay, there are other control groups, but the only one that wasn't going to get the treatment was all black. So obviously, syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that they had a cure for. Okay, because if you know, remember our history of drugs and drug laws, right? There was a piece in there with sulfa drugs. So sulfa drugs, really toxic but effective antibiotic. You could use to treat syphilis. So what they found was penicillin. Now, of course, Africans and Chinese have been cultivating bread molds for penicillin for 5,000 years. I don't know why it took the Americans to the 20th century to find out about penicillin, but there you have it. All right, so that control group, all black, untreated for an STD. All right, so they're illiterate. So, you know, syphilis, can you spell syphilis correctly? Is it in your vocabulary? What are these sores? Et cetera, et cetera. What are these other effects? Now, at this point in 1932, we already knew what happened with end-stage syphilis. Syphilis, if untreated, and treatment is simple, will kill you. We already knew from Al Capone what happens with end-stage syphilis. You go crazy, you go blind, you go all kinds of things. We already know, right, at this point. But science marches on. All right, so the data for the experiment was to be collected from autopsies of the men, and they were thus deliberately left to degenerate under the ravages of tertiary syphilis, which can include tumors, heart disease, paralysis, blindness, insanity. As I see it, one of the doctors involved explained, we have no further interest in these patients until they die. All right, well, what if this control group was in Manhattan? Or Brooklyn? Or Connecticut? Or, right, so they had a scientific interest in letting these people go to end stage and dying. Right, so that's not exactly objective and unbiased. But here we go. All right, the true nature of the experiment had to be kept from the subjects to ensure their cooperation. Duh. Right? Can't tell people you're in a scientific experiment which will kill you if you participate in it fully. Sharecroppers' grossly disadvantaged lot in life made it easy to manipulate. So pleased at the prospect of free medical care, that's what they were offered. That was their inducement in the study. Almost none of them had ever seen a doctor before, again, because of poverty. So understand, poverty is a form of violence. It is not an accident. Okay, it's caused by structures. So these unsophisticated and trusting men became the pawns in what James Jones, author of the excellent history on the subject Bad Blood, testified as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. Okay, so the study was meant to discover how syphilis affected blacks as opposed to whites. That's why there's black and white control groups, right? The theory being that whites experienced more neurological complications from syphilis, whereas blacks were more susceptible to cardiovascular damage. So this is also part of the theory that whites have more advanced nervous systems, more intelligent. That's why we're looking for that. Now, scientifically, it is a fact that even though we are basically the same genotype, we have different phenotypes, how we look. There are some differences based on that in terms of disease. However, those differences may be more insignificant than the significance of race. You just correct for them. You know, like my eye doctor says, okay, well, you're African American, you have this family history of glaucoma, your pressures are high, let's give you eye drops, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I was surprised and actually pleased that this white doctor knew that and was actually comfortable telling me that. Great.
Skin cancer.
Skin cancer, right, those kind of things. Is this skin? Okay. I'm not worried about skin cancer, right? But other folks are. I have been kissed by the sun. All right? So whereas blacks were more susceptible to cardiovascular damage, how this knowledge would change clinical treatment of syphilis is uncertain, since the treatment is basically antibiotics. But, you know, especially at this level and this time period where they don't really have the more sophisticated genetic knowledge that we do now about how different drugs affect different folks. Because we also do know that different drugs affect different folks. People do have allergies to penicillin. That can be life-threatening. I haven't looked at whether these differences play out racially or not. I'm not allergic. I do know people that are black. So to persuade the community to support the experiment, one of the original doctors admitted it was necessary to carry on this study under the guise of a demonstration and provide treatment. At first, the men were prescribed the syphilis remedy of the day, bismuth, neoarsifamine, and mercury. You understand that those are all toxic metallic substances that can kill you. They're basically applying a medieval technology. Maybe you didn't know this, but one of the reasons gold was so valuable is that people were actually grinding up into a powder and taking it as a medicine. I'm not making this up. You know, I don't have to make stuff up. It's like, this is so crazy, it's true. But okay, really. Yeah, the rich people, 18th century, 19th century, basically, believe that certain metals, this is why you can buy, silver, the colloidal silver, not just used against vampires on TV, okay? It's a strong antibiotic. It works, right? So gold, they thought grinding up gold and eating gold would actually help them. Health benefits, right? So they were basically, that's what an apothecary was, grinding up different metallic substances and, mercury would work. It would kill the host first, but that's a cure, right? All right, so, but in such small amounts that only 3% showed any improvement. All right. These token doses of medicine were good public relations and did not interfere with the true aims of the study because they're not entirely effective. And what's going to happen is they're going to alleviate some of the symptoms. right? So it'll be similar. I have this ridiculous image, but I'll tell you tell you about it anyway, right? So Iron Man 2, Nick Fury, you know, he's sitting in the donut restaurant and he's got that stuff from the palladium that's poisoning him, and Black Widow comes up and injects him with this stuff, and the stuff starts disappearing. Well, great. You didn't actually cure the fact that you're poisoning yourself, but we just got rid of some of the symptoms. That's all that did. Didn't actually kill the bug. Just alleviated some of the symptoms. All right? And since it doesn't really kill the bug, then we can continue on with the study. Eventually, all syphilis treatment was replaced with pink medicine, that is aspirin, to ensure that the men would show up for a painful and potentially dangerous spinal tap. The public health doctors misled them with a letter full of promotional hype. All right, so again, aspirin is not treatment for syphilis. It will resolve some of the fever. Maybe. Okay? Last chance for a special free treatment. The fact that autopsies would eventually be required was also concealed. As the doctor explained, if the colored population becomes aware that accepting free hospital care meant a post-mortem, every darky will leave Macon County. Even the Surgeon General of the United States participated in enticing the men to remain in the experiment, sending them certificates of appreciation after 25 years in the study. That would be 1959. Or 57. In any case, the doctor for the country is basically participating in the ruse. So this goes up to the highest level. So a little more later, but basically, one can also point out and look at that as a model for delivering health care. Tuskegee would have actually been a great model. They're using black doctors and black nurses to deliver health care to people that didn't have it. Only problem was, no effective health care was delivered. And black people colluded on that. So, more about that later, because I'm just giving you the context for what happens, what the setup is. This is not the only time this happened. And not just to black people. Okay? So we'll look at that when we get into the 90s and into the aughts. So, that culture. So, like many Southern black families, my family left New Orleans at the start of the war to work in the war industries. So my Uncle Mitch was one of the first black longshoremen in San Francisco. We were one of the first black families to integrate the Haight-Ashbury. So there were pickets, petitions to have us move out. We're still there. So my family, of course, would not have been welcome in Eugene during the war. In fact, no people of color, as I've repeatedly said, were allowed to live within the city limits even if they had fought in the war. So black war veterans could not legally buy housing in Eugene, and it's perfectly legal to discriminate against them. And we'll return to that. So some details about Japanese internment. So these concentration camps are still in existence, and they're still here for the rest of us, should they decide to use them. So 70% of Japanese in America